Welcome back to another Silicon Bites. Now, I know a lot of people have been covering this story, but of course, I wanted to put my own spin on it as well. This is about Kremlin Carlson and his meeting with Steve Witkoff, Trump's representative in the peace negotiations, so-called peace negotiations. Well, before we get into this episode, thank you to everybody who is supporting the channel, everybody who's helping to raise funds for the various campaigns that we've got going, including the new one to raise money for more trucks to send to Ukraine. All the details of that will be in the description of the video. This episode explores the interview between Tucker Carlson and President Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, which premiered on March the 21st, 2025 on the Tucker Carlson Show. Of course, most of the analysis and the 1,000,001 memes on social media that have been launched by this clown show of a podcast miss the point. This is not a question of bad information leading to poor strategy. And if only good information were injected into the political environment, suddenly all would be well and a sensible strategy would emerge. No, this is a question of bad intent. Yes, Trump is likely sincere when he wants to end the war, because without its end, it's far harder for him to make money from it. From Ukraine especially. It's far harder to stabilize the global economy and achieve declines in oil and gas prices to fire up industrial growth and lower consumer prices. Again, that's as he sees it. It's not out of love for humanity or a fervent desire for peace. It's about the midterm elections and delivering tangible dividends for his base voters. What the Witkoff conversation lays bare, but which few seem to want to acknowledge, the bad information and repetition of Kremlin narratives is beneficial to the strategy to stop the war at any cost. And Trump, who is Witkoff's boss, not the US, not the US foreign policy, not US citizens or the legislature, no, Trump is personally and literally the only commander he cares about. The lies are useful because they have almost certainly decided that the capitulation and dismemberment of Ukraine is the easiest and fastest way to achieve peace. In their minds, peace has a downside and an upside price, and they expect Ukraine to pay the downside costs while Trump and his acolytes can achieve the upside profits. It's simply a business deal to them. Witkoff is not an analyst or a moderator, as Mark Galeotti explains on X. He's a political hitman out to impose a particular deal, and he'll say what he needs to set it up and to justify it. And Witkoff is taking the path of least resistance, that is, moral and intellectual resistance. And he is regurgitating Kremlin lies verbatim. Does he genuinely believe them, or does he not? At this point, it's almost immaterial because the strategic intent is clear. Ukraine must lose, surrender its assets, agree to Moscow's maximalist demands, and know its place in the world. A place of civility towards the large nuclear powers. Europe beware, because this is the role earmarked for us as well. Has anyone actually told Trump that France has got an independent nuclear deterrent? And Trump will not tolerate any countries get in the way of his plan. That is, any countries that continue to supply Ukraine to help keep them in the fight. Watch out for all the classics and have your Kremlin bullshit bingo cards to hand to tick them off. Lie. Ukraine isn't a real country, but was created by Lenin. Fact, Ukraine is much older than Russia. Lie, Ukraine has no cards. Fact, Ukraine continues to attrit Russian oil infrastructure and has now invaded Belgorod. But Trump is Witkoff's boss, and he has his orders. Get the war stopped, whatever it takes. Unfortunately, none of the strategies they've chosen put the onus of concessions onto Moscow. According to some sources, the White House expected the UK to publicly criticize Zelensky after the debacle in the Oval Office. British PM Keir Starmer revealed that following the meeting in the Oval Office, the US administration pressured the UK to issue statements critical of President Zelensky. This is not just standard diplomacy, but an attempt by Washington to fracture the alliance supporting Ukraine by turning London against Kiev. Expect more of the same. Fortunately, Britain did not take the bait. We continue to make soft diplomatic noises in public about the US, but it must be clear to strategic planners in London that the US is an unreliable ally when it tries to sabotage alliances to the benefit of Putin. It's a dangerous tightrope to walk when the US, previously a guarantor of European security and sovereignty, now acts as an adversary. In the interview with Tucker Carlson, Steve Witkoff says it is largely accepted that NATO membership for Ukraine is not an option. He added to this, claiming that Kiev has agreed to organize presidential elections in Ukraine without providing details or evidence backing up his claim. The Trump administration has been ramping up pressure to force Ukraine into organizing a wartime election, which Zelensky is constitutionally barred from doing. And I will absolutely refuse to forget also the time when Trump described Zelensky as a dictator without elections, an insult that perfectly aligns with Russian narratives that have sought to undermine the legitimacy of Ukraine's leadership. Wartime elections would expose Ukraine to Russia's destabilization tactics and be a logistical nightmare to organize across the war-torn country, especially during such bombardments as we've seen over the last couple of days. Witkoff addressed Ukraine's potential entry into the NATO military alliance, which Russia fiercely opposes. If there's going to be a peace deal, Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. I think that's largely accepted, he said. But he did concede that other alliances or arrangements could provide some of the cover that would have been provided by NATO's Article 5, but he did not elaborate on the detail. Moscow has said multiple times that a guarantee would be unacceptable, as would peacekeeping forces from any NATO member on the territory of Ukraine. And yet, if NATO members are not present, there really is no viable or dependable peacekeeping force. But Witkoff says the elephant in the room in peace talks is whether Ukraine will cede occupied regions. And he explicitly refers to Crimea and the 4 mainland Ukrainian oblasts occupied by Russia, even though he clearly cannot name them all, and even though those oblasts are not fully occupied. While issues of territory still need ironing out, he said, he claimed the administration was making progress that no one thought was possible with Russia. At the same time, this scale, intensity and ferocity of Russia's drone attacks have reached an unprecedented level. If this is Witkoff's definition of success, I'd hate to see what he deems to be a failure. Let's remind ourselves that the 4 regions which Witkoff struggled to name were illegally annexed during Russia's invasion. The Kremlin staged referenda on joining Russia in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, or at least the parts that it had occupied, which are seen by Kiev and by the international community as a propaganda exercise and nothing more. Witless Witkoff repeats the lie that these referenda are evidence of their desire to split from Ukraine. Also, that because some people in those areas speak Russian, they should be part of Russia. They're Russian-speaking, Witkoff said of the 4 eastern regions. There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule. By this same moronic logic, this little corner of Oxfordshire is also an oblast of the Kremlin because I speak Russian, and Witkoff, by the same rule, would be British. Witkoff said the constitutional issues with Ukraine as to what they can concede with regards to territory had become the elephant in the room during negotiations. Talks are set to resume Monday in Saudi Arabia, with US officials set to meet officials from both Russia and Ukraine. The Russians are de facto in control of these territories, he said. The question is, will the world acknowledge that those are Russian territories? Witkov asked, can Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky survive politically if he acknowledges this? This is the central issue in the conflict. Well, let's clarify a few things for Witkov. Those territories are not Russian, not by dint of the languages spoken in them, or the fact that Russia invaded and annexed them, nor because of the fake referenda, or because of the copious blood Russia has shed during this barbarous act of theft. No country that respects sovereign borders or the rule of law can or should accept those territories as being anything other than Ukraine. Russia does not even fully occupy 3 of the 4 regions. For goodness sake, there is no elephant in the room, but a gargantuan set of lies, monstrous Hitlerian lies, which Witkov has allowed to enter the room, invited into the room, in fact. Zelensky stressed last weekend that Ukraine's position is that we do not recognize the occupied Ukrainian territories as Russian. In the long interview with Tucker Carlson, Witkoff revealed that Putin had commissioned a portrait of Donald Trump and sent it to him. Witkoff said he was impressed by how gracious the Russian leader had been during the pair's discussions, praising him as smart and straightforward. It seems that manipulation and flattery work just as well on the minion as they do on the master. And the idea of sharing portraits, well, that is an extraordinary piece of medieval diplomacy. Before meeting Putin in Moscow, Witkoff said someone in the Trump administration warned him to watch it because he's an ex-KGB guy. Witkoff apparently downplayed the person's fears, saying Putin's background in the agency was a measure of his intelligence. In the old days, the only people who went into the KGB were the smartest people in the nation. He's a super smart guy, he recalled saying. Malicious minds may be thinking that Witkoff would have stood no chance at all of getting into the KGB based on that definition. But let's also remember that Putin was not a top-level agent or strategist, but a menial thug and a psychological bully stuck in a dead-end job in the career-killing Blackwater, and psychological bully stuck in a dead-end job in the career-killing backwater of Dresden in Germany. I don't regard Putin as a bad guy, Witkoff said, saying it was gracious of the Russian leader to receive him in Moscow for talks earlier this month. That meeting got personal, he said, recalling how Putin had commissioned a beautiful portrait of President Trump from the leading Russian artist. Witkoff also claimed that following the assassination attempt against Trump in September, Putin has said he went to his local church and met with his priest and prayed for Trump, not because he could become the president of the United States, but because he had a friendship with him. Maybe no one pointed out that that priest was probably also a KGB agent. I don't regard Putin as a bad guy, he said. That is a complicated situation, that war and all the ingredients that led up to it, Witkoff noted. Trump was clearly touched by Putin's story and the portrait. Again, we can bemoan the idiocy, the naivety, and the grotesqueness of these statements, but that does not change the underlying strategy that they point to. If peace is the objective, that it can be achieved using any means, and the path of least resistance in the understanding of Trump and Witkoff is for Ukraine to lose catastrophically, and not the other way around. Witkoff implied that resolving the war in Ukraine could lead to cooperation on a broader range of issues, and that the two sides were thinking about integrating their energy policies in the Arctic, sharing sea lanes, collaborating on artificial intelligence, and sending liquefied natural gas into Europe together. For those that think Trump's talk of annexing Canada and Greenland is a joke, well, take note. He is deadly serious, and they would form a key strategic component in his rapprochement with Putin, and a carve-up of the resources of the Northern Hemisphere in a modern-day Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, except now it's the Witkoff Lavrov Pact or something of that sort. Who doesn't want to have a world where Russia and the United States are doing collaboratively good things together, he asked. For one, that's not a world I would welcome. I've lived in Russia. I've travelled all over Russia. Believe me, governance is not their strength, nor is economics, investment, infrastructure, or fairness, or basic humanity, to just name a few things. I just don't see Putin wanting to take over all of Europe, said Witkoff. I take him at his word. I think Europeans are coming around to this view too. Well, Orban possibly thinks this way, and this may be where Witkoff heard it from. But the rest of us? We do not take Putin at his word, and we are not stupid enough to think he'll stop at Ukraine. He wants all of that country and a lot more besides. His propagandists have talked of little else but conquest for 3 years in a row. Well, to close out this podcast, we shall also look at another area where Witkoff's witless comments align perfectly with Kremlin talking points. He dismissed Starmer's plan for Ukraine as a posture and a pose. The so-called coalition of the willing has Sir Keir Starmer's name on it and calls for an international force to support a ceasefire. Witkoff said the idea was based on a simplistic notion of the UK Prime Minister and other European leaders thinking that we've all got to be like Winston Churchill. He also dismissed the idea that there is any similarity to the current situation and World War II, mocking the idea that Putin has any territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine or even beyond the boundaries of the 4 oblasts. During the interview with Carlson, Witkoff repeated various Russian arguments, including that Ukraine was a false country, and asked when the world would recognize occupied Ukrainian territory as Russian. He said the largest issue in the conflict are these so-called 4 regions, Donbass, Crimea. Well, you know the names, and there are these other 2 as well. No mention, of course, of the innumerable war crimes that Russia has committed, the stolen children, etc., etc. Witkoff made many assertions that are either not true or are disputed by everybody except the Russians. He repeated the lie that Ukrainian troops in Kursk were surrounded, something denied by Ukraine's government and uncorroborated by any open source data. Witkoff also repeated several Kremlin talking points about the cause of Russia's full-scale invasion. He said it was correct that from the Russian perspective, the partly occupied territories were now part of Russia. The elephant in the room is that there are constitutional issues within Ukraine as to what they can concede to with regard to giving up territory. The Russians are de facto in control of these territories. The question is, will the world acknowledge that those are Russian territories? No, it will not, as Russia's actions do not align with international law as well as the Ukrainian constitution. These territories are only claimed by Russia, and very few countries, including some of Russia's allies, have recognized these claims. He added, there's a sensibility in Russia that Ukraine is just a false country, that they just patch together in this sort of mosaic, these regions, and that's what is the root cause, in my opinion, of this war, that Russia regards those 5 regions as rightfully theirs since World War II, and that's something nobody wants to talk about. In this comment, he goes far beyond simply repeating Russian garbage, but himself sides with that narrative. Nor is any of this the actual root cause of the war, nor is NATO either, but it's the movement of Ukraine towards the West and its desire to join the EU. And none of these 4 oblasts have been claimed by Russia prior to 2022. And Crimea was only claimed in 2014. Lie after lie comes out of Witkoff's mouth, slanderous, despicable, and immoral falsehoods. Witkoff said in the Tucker Carlson interview, why would they want to absorb Ukraine? For what purpose? They don't need to absorb Ukraine. They have reclaimed these 5 regions. They have Crimea, and they've gotten what they want. So why do they need more? The Russians are going to march across Europe? That is preposterous, by the way. Let's remember the reality. Russia tried to seize all of Ukraine in 2022. And there are no indications that Putin has disavowed these ambitions. There is a strong suspicion that he wanted to punch through and take Moldova as well. It's only military weakness on the Russian side, poor planning, grandiose ambition, and Ukrainian resistance that prevented this from happening, and prevented it in 2014 and prevented it again in 2022. Witkoff also said a ceasefire in the Black Sea would be implemented over the next week or so, and we are not far away from a full 30-day ceasefire. Calling a ceasefire in the Black Sea is convenient since Ukraine has already forced the Russian Black Sea fleet out of that theatre. The Witless Witkoff ceasefire risks inviting them back into the Black Sea and destabilizing that region. To conclude, Witkoff is an agent of Trump. Trump is an asset to the Kremlin. Washington has aligned with all of Putin's spoken goals and is seeking to cajole, coerce, and blackmail Ukraine and its allies into accepting them. We don't know what other goals are unspoken, but of course Russian propagandists give some strong hints towards them. The path of least resistance, as they see it, is to force Ukraine to submit to Russia, to a partial or even complete capitulation. In their minds, Ukraine is now a barrier to lucrative business deals, and Zelensky is the primary impediment. The path of least resistance for them, politically, economically, militarily, is to force a defeat on Ukraine. To them, it's just another crooked business transaction. Fortunately, they are as wrong as they are moronic and immoral. Ukraine will not submit. Britain will not abandon Ukraine. Russia is not strong. Russia will not be forever either.